What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Avernum, Escape from the Pit, which is the remake of a remake that released all the way back in 2012, revitalizing, of course, the original 1995 CRPG. As a guy who plays a lot of CRPGs, this one's been on my list for a long time, as is the case with much of Spiderweb Software's work, though I have played a couple of the Geneforge titles at this particular point. But the reason in particular that we're taking a look at Avernum, beyond that, is the fact that Avernum 4 is actually getting a proper remake that is supposed to release later this year, probably towards the end of the year, and I've been trying to go through the originals before that happens. Normally, this is where I'd tell you about the 100% reviews, all that. Links are below if you want more information, but given the age of this title, I think we can just move on. And with that, let's actually talk about the game itself. So, Avernum, Escape from the Pit is an old-school isometric CRPG, but I also said it's the remake of a remake, so what's that about? Well, the original Avernum, which was actually known as Exile, Escape from the Pit, released back in 1995 as a shareware, or demoware as it was known, which is a game that would let you play a significant portion of it before, forcing you to buy it to actually finish the game. Now, that was remade as Avernum quite some time ago, before Avernum itself got remade into Avernum Escape from the Pit back in 2012. These days, the game is available on Steam. You can pick it up for a whole $10 over there, which is full price. You can regularly find it on sale along with the rest of its releases, mind you. But what really sets Avernum apart is actually its incredibly interesting world, which sees us cast down into the pits and caves of Avernum, as you might imagine. And while we'll get into the details of all that here in a moment, I wanted up front to say that the main thing this game reminded me of is a lot of the old school D&D modules. You see, many people these days are used to modules for tabletop games that are more focused and linear, whereas a lot of the old ones tended to be more open-ended. And that's kind of, at least in my opinion, how Avernum approaches things. You're kind of given a sort of ambiguous goal of surviving Avernum after you're cast down in there, and that's going to lead you to all sorts of different places, really. But how you go about that and explore and do things on your own time is largely only going to be limited by your party's capabilities at that time, which I kind of enjoyed. It makes exploring Avernum and its cave systems feel a lot like you're exploring an actual moving world, even though it obviously is a bit limited by technology on that front. Perhaps unsurprisingly, though, given just the general look of the title, it is certainly lacking in a certain amount of quality of life changes we've seen over the more than a decade since this game's release, and it is obviously not voice acted or anything like that, so all stuff to note going into this. But let's talk about how this game is running, which is always an interesting note for older titles, but given that Escape from the Pit specifically released back in 2012, this game runs perfectly fine on modern hardware. It's not exactly graphically intensive, if you'd believe it, so it'll run on most everything. The only thing I really noted was that it does seem to struggle with 4K monitors specifically. Oftentimes the sort of UI scaler that it uses and things like that will cut off portions of the UI, and you gotta adjust some settings to get it to work, but on everything else you should probably be okay. If, a little zoomed out, let's say. Now, obviously that can be a problem. Some of the text is very, very small, so you're probably going to want to mess around with the settings there, but you should be able to make it work if you don't mind fiddling with it a little bit. Otherwise, it's really not much else to say. Next up, I wanted to talk the difficulty of this title. So, this game features a number of different difficulties, from casual through torment. Now, normal is very much so the intended experience. Hard and torment are just that, difficult difficulty modes. If you've ever played a lot of older games in general, you're probably aware of that, but as someone who has played through things like the Legacy of Baal difficulty on the old Baldur's Gate titles, as well as completed the Ultimate very recently for Pillars of Eternity 2, it's not the kind of thing that bothers me in particular, but do keep in mind, normal is generally the way to go here. But if you insist on cranking it up just to crank it up, the beginning of torment difficulty is very hard, as you might imagine. Everything hits very hard. And that's most of what the difficulty changes, is health and damage numbers. And a lot of that is mitigated through straight up crowd control, as well as protecting yourself via things like invulnerability potions later on, but any edge you can get via buffs that you can cast on yourself, that kind of thing. And we'll get into that a little bit more later in the combat section, but all that to say, Torment difficulty is quite difficult, and if you want to play this for yourself, I would suggest running through the game on at least normal first, especially if you don't play a lot of these games. Now, to get the ball rolling a little bit, we do have to make a 4-person party to actually start the game. So we are playing as a group of 4 individuals who are cast into Avernum, which means we have to make all 4 characters. Generally speaking, this game's characters that you can make, while they do have a variety of classes available to them, can nonetheless largely be boiled down to a few different archetypes. General fighter types, archers, mages, and priests. This is just kind of how the skills are divided up, which we'll get into. Of all of those, the only one I would say to really be mindful of is the archer in particular. Not so much because their damage is bad, but as I learned over the course of my own playthroughs, it's that they lack a lot of things like AoE abilities, which are really what you need to deal with a lot of the very large groups of numbers of enemies that you're going to be dealing with. And so while damage-wise, archers are fine single target, they really just don't have that kind of oomph that you need to kill large swaths of enemies, and they don't really have the resilience of a fighter to stay alive, which is what you're going to need on them. But otherwise, you're pretty free form. Now, you can pick a class or pick a custom start, which will let you sort of freely apply your starting abilities and traits and whatnot. But you're going to get a lot of this stuff over the course of the playthrough, so pick whatever you're comfortable with and you should be okay. Probably worth a mention that the game, because it is the remake of a remake, I imagine, does come with a character editor that you can enable, which will, of course, let you edit your character, which is a pretty decent way to make sure that you are not sort of permanently locked because you can't get past something or you built your party in the wrong way, that kind of thing. Which, you know, for the case of, again, a remake of a remake, and the game itself being very old, I don't think is really a big deal. As if anything, I think it will allow more people to get into this title and experience it for themselves. So that's something you can access straight from the main menu of the title. Now, generally speaking, you're going to want at least one sort of melee fighter guy to tank, if nothing else. Somebody who can cast the mage spells, somebody who can cast the priest spells, and then there's a few different abilities you'll pick up as you level up as part of progression called cave lore, arcane lore, and tool use. But before we get into all the nuance of that, let's start first with the story setup. What is actually going on in this game? So, while normally I might advise you against things like spoilers here, it is obviously an extremely old title, but while I don't want to go fully in depth on the story, I will say that it would be hard to do that even if I wanted to, because the story itself is very sort of non-linear and open-ended. But the setup for it is that we, our entire party, have been unjustly accused of crimes by simply speaking out against the tyrannical empire, and what the tyrannical empire does to criminals in this world is chucks them into a portal to they have no idea where, just a general place known as Avernum. You come to find out shortly after this happens that Avernum is a sort of underground cavern system that is incredibly expansive. Now, your main goal here is to basically survive, adapt, overcome, but also, potentially escape or maybe even seek revenge on the Empire. And then how you go about that is essentially by going around doing quests, exploring, potentially uncovering leads to one of the game's 3 great quests, it calls it. So while there are a nonsense amount of quests and things to explore in this game, the sort of fundamental plot comes down to what they refer to as the 3 great quests. These are essentially the quests that will lead you to one of the game's endings. Now, all of these endings kind of blend together, and none of them actually stop you from playing the game. You will continue to play after it if you want, which means it is possible to do all of them in one go. One could argue that the sort of true ending is in fact doing all of them. And one of them, I would say, unsurprisingly the hardest to get, I believe is actually the setup for Avernum 2. But in the meantime, you're going to be going around to the various towns and settlements around Avernum, making friends and influencing people, getting to grips with the various factions that have taken control of the various great caverns. One of them is literally called the Great Caverns, but generally the world of Avernum is divided up into its different cavernous systems, and your job is simply to explore and deal with all of that. And generally speaking, I would say they do a really good job of it. The more of Spiderweb Software's games that I have played, the more I have become a fan of the writing of Jeff Vogel, like the main guy behind Spiderweb Software, mind you. And I will say that what these games lack for, sort of graphical fidelity and impressive visuals, that kind of thing, and even some quality of life, they really do make up for in terms of just interesting stories being told, which on top of the fact that none of these games are particularly expensive, certainly helps it along as well. But generally, I really enjoyed the setup for this, and learning more about life down here and just how things have been operating with the various factions and monsters was a really good time, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. I'm looking forward to the second one to see how some of this stuff plays out, in fact. Which brings me to the progression systems. So, let's talk how your characters are going to be leveling up, because as we kill monsters and complete quests, we're going to be getting experience, which is going to level us up. Now, the game has a sort of soft max level of about 30. This is your sort of main bulk of progression, your 1 to 30 levels. Now, the thing is, you can level up past 30, it's just that the sort of benefits of doing that massively slow down, and it honestly is difficult just content-wise in terms of things to do to get past that level anyway. But your main goal should basically be to get to 30. Now, every level we're going to get to spend an attribute point, 2 skill points, and every other level will pick a trait. Now, your attributes, the 4 of them, are pretty much what you'd expect. Strength, dexterity, endurance, and intelligence. So if you are playing a caster, you want intelligence. If you're playing melee, you want strength. If you're doing like bows or whatever, you want dexterity. And then everybody wants a little bit of endurance. Now the thing is, as you level up, you'll also get an increase to one of these attributes passively on a sort of a cycle, regardless of whether or not you put points into it. So they will sort of naturally rise with you a bit as well, but generally you want to put a point into your main attribute almost every level, and then maybe chuck one into endurance every once in a while. Now skills are where things get interesting, because this is, of course, where we're going to sort of really make our characters what they are. We've got a sort of melee combat tree, the spell casty tree, which is combined with some miscellaneous stuff you're probably going to want. Now, in order to get further up these trees, you do have to put points into, of course, the sort of bottom rank there, and then the ones above that rank can only be as high as the rank below it. These aren't particularly diverse, but I will say that everyone wants probably 15 points in the combat tree at some point, if you can swing it, but probably not early on. And this is because that is going to give you access by default to an ability called Adrenaline Rush, which you can use in combat, which effectively allows you to move multiple times, which is going to be really necessary late into the game. Otherwise, this is pretty straightforward progression. If you are playing combat, you put the points into whatever combat discipline you happen to be using, because that is your main chance to hit and everything. So putting that into combat is also going to, as a result of that, offset the penalty of wearing heavier and heavier armor, which eats into your chance to hit normally. But as long as you're putting points into that, it of course evens out. Now, if you're playing a mage, you want them to put points into mage spells so they can cast their mage spells, and then priests put their points into priest spells as their sort of main. But we get 2 training points per level, so you can put a point into your sort of main thing. So again, mage spells or priest spells for each of those, and then your main combat discipline. And then you have 1 other point to spend after that on whatever you want. This could be the ranks above those, which are going to give you, say, better damage potentially, more chance to hit, reduction of incoming damage, that kind of thing. But you also are going to want to juggle that against the miscellaneous stuff that are really necessary. This is tool use, first aid, cave lore, and arcane lore, I would say. So tool use is your just ability to pick locks. And then cave lore is actually what is going to allow you to find secret passages throughout the caves of Avernum, on top of finding hidden caches as well, that which you can dig up if you have enough cave lore, and it will even help you out in some text events. Very important that you get that to at least 12, though you can only put points in it up to 10, which is where the trainers come in, and we'll talk about those in a moment. Arcane lore is going to allow you to read from pedestals. Various book pedestals throughout the game can potentially either teach you or improve your versions of spells that you've learned for either mage or priest disciplines, but you have to have the ability to read those texts, which is where arcane lore comes in. And then first aid is simply sort of passive healing that happens after combat, which I just found generally useful late in the game when you have to do a lot of healing and energy management, that kind of thing, and it helps you sustain yourself for longer without having to visit town. But that's sort of the gist of the way progression works. Everything else is really just down to equipment, which, again, is going to depend on what kind of class you're playing, but stuff that gives you armor while simultaneously not eating into your chance to hit is generally the way to go, but there are armor pieces that will boost individual little skills or abilities, give them either minor or in some cases massive boosts to help you out, and you'll kind of diversify how each character plays a little bit based on that. Now, honestly, pretty simple system, but as is the case with much of this game, they really did a lot with a little here. Now, before we move on, I briefly mentioned trainers there. So it is possible throughout the world of Avernum to find people who can train you in things. They will give you up to 2 levels for each individual character of training in an individual skill. This is actually how you can sort of break past the cap for things like, say, cave lore or tool use to let you get to those higher numbers. It's also how you're going to learn things like your spells generally, and that in combination with the pedestals is how you reach their maximum rank of 3 to make them the most effective they can be, which can give them extra effects and stuff. So as long as you know that stuff and you get it figured out pretty quick, I think you'll be okay. And that brings us to the gameplay and world. So as I mentioned, we have been thrown down into the chasms of Avernum. This itself can be divided up between individual locations as well as the world map that we'll be traversing. Those individual locations are basically either towns or dungeons, which are generally going to be filled with factions or enemies to fight. Now, this game goes hard on the enemies to fight, and we'll talk more about that in combat, but man, oh man, is there a lot of stuff trying to kill you all the time. Probably a little too much if I'm being honest. Sometimes you'll clear out a dungeon only to be ambushed like 3 or 4 times on your way out the door, and it gets to be a little much, honestly. Especially when some of these fights in turn-based, which the game is going to be slow, frankly. But first up, the gameplay world here is surprisingly big. Like, honestly, a lot bigger than I thought it was going to be, especially given the age of the title. And in order to facilitate travel between these various places, there's some things you should know about navigating these caves. For starters, you can, of course, run into random encounters, which will ambush you. You can physically see them coming at you on the world map, though, so they can be avoided to some degree. And I believe it's the cave lore skill that will occasionally just give you the option to just avoid the encounter entirely. But in order to get around, we're probably first going to want to activate the teleporters. This is going to see us going around to pylons at the various places we can teleport to and activating them by interacting with them. But in order to use them at all, you first have to make your way to the Tower of Magi and learn about them from the main guy sort of facilitating the teleporters. And those are a huge time saver. But there's also rivers and waterways down here, which means we're going to need a boat to navigate those. And thankfully, boats are pretty cheap. You can buy one in a few different towns and, sail around in, though do keep in mind, the game is not going to tell you where you left said boats, and not all the waterways are connected, so you're likely going to have to find or utilize more than one in different areas to actually, use them. Much later on, you can even access a hidden orb called the Orb of Thralny, which will allow you to fly, as the game says it, but functionally it's more like a small teleport, which will help you cross gaps and things that you otherwise could not get across. And while you're doing all of that, you might just come across little hidden interactions. There is stuff that does not actively show on the game's world map, but if you get close to, you'll get a sort of special text encounter and can interact with it that way. This can be, good things, like, say, encountering a small house out in the world map that, maybe has somebody who's willing to sell you things or give you an item, or perhaps there's an encounter to be had there in terms of having to fight something off, etc., etc. And then there's all the actual hidden caches. What's more, though, with the cave lore skill, you can actually make your way through certain hidden passages, which are marked by like certain fungus and ivy on the wall that you'll kind of get used to, but if you walk up to those, you'll generally reveal a secret hidden place that, more often than not, is going to give you loot and everything, which is a pretty fun way to handle exploration. But one thing I really enjoyed about this is that despite the graphical fidelity, every sort of town you interact with does genuinely feel unique, and as I mentioned, they're divided up into factions. Much of Avernum is ruled by the Avernites under the rule of King Micah, who operates out of the castle. Whereas there's a hidden group called the Scimitar that you will try to potentially find, I suppose. You don't actually have to. They have their own goals and motivations. There's a potential upstart sort of city-state getting a foothold in the world called the Freehold of Caius, ruled by Caius, if you'd believe it. And then there's more rough and tumble places like the Abyss, they call it, a sort of desolate section of the caverns that are exceptionally dangerous. And this is home to things like a particularly cranky dragon, a particularly cantankerous wizard who's holed up in a tower that you're going to need to discover on your own, and you might even run into some agents from the Empire down here, and all of that kind of weaves together organically to form the 3 great quests that I mentioned, which you can either blunder your way into or perhaps more elegantly research and find your way into. And the whole thing really does play out as this sort of non-linear adventure where you're just trying to get your feet in the door, only to actually start surviving and then thriving and then doing quests for powerful people, and then suddenly you've got options in terms of making Avernum safe, potentially finding a way out, and potentially striking back at the very empire that sent you down here in the beginning. And I think that's a really wonderfully executed bit of gameplay across this game, and I think the sort of art style and things putting people off of it is probably a real shame, because if you can get past that, I think there's genuinely something really special here, and that is probably, unsurprisingly then, why the game has become such a cult classic over the years. Because in spite of that high praise, let's be honest, it's not exactly the easiest game to play. Like, literally gameplay-wise, because of how it looks and how the UI is, and as a result, it's just generally kind of hard to get into. But with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about combat now. So, combat in this game is a turn-based, action point-based affair, where we are going to utilize our various abilities, battle disciplines, spells, etc. on our turn while trying to mitigate everything the enemy is doing. Now, this starts off easy enough. However, in the late game, it sort of starts to balloon in terms of the numbers of enemies you are facing, alongside the, I would say, very liberal use of crowd control, both by you as well as the enemies you're facing. Because in order to overcome those eventually overwhelming numbers you're going to be fighting, you're going to have to start utilizing AoEs and crowd control, various spells that rob as many of the enemy's turns as you can, or simply killing them so quickly via AoEs, buffed up by Adrenaline Rush, so that you can whittle their numbers down on your turn so you can get past them. Now, generally, that can be where putting a few points in dexterity for each character is very helpful as well, because this will actually bump up your initiative, which means you go first, which means enemies don't, start their turn by like 15 to 20 of them immediately bashing you in the head until you die against your measly 4 characters. So learning how to turn the tides against the enemy especially is really the key to victory here. And luckily, if you're curious, the game has been out long enough that you can absolutely find guides and full 100% walkthroughs, alongside even character builds that people recommend and have tried and tested, that kind of thing. But understand this more than anything, there is a lot of combat in Avernum. And as you may have noticed, I didn't really talk about stealth or anything. That's because you really don't have any options but to deal with this combat at some point, and that can be extremely tedious after a while. I think the writing and everything is good enough to get past that, and I think the general character building of each of your party and teammates is enjoyable enough that it's not so big a deal. But there was a point where I was playing this and I was just kind of exhausted of the constant ambushes and stuff, and in that regard, I would say Avernum can definitely be a game that just kind of doesn't know when to quit sometimes, which I think if you want to play this for yourself might be something to actually prepare for. But with that said, let's talk some of the more specifics of how this works. So if you've honestly played, something like Geneforge like I have, I think you'll get this pretty much immediately. But on your turn, generally speaking, your turn ends when you attack. This is because that is going to spend pretty much all of the action points you have. Before that, however, it only takes 1 action point to actually make an attack. Even if it, costs more than that, you can always make the attack with a single action point. But if you have more than the points required, you can then make a second attack. And sometimes with skills like Quick Action or Adrenaline Rush, you can sort of force that to be the case. Or even things like Hasted, which just gives you a % chance of getting another attack. So generally, you're going to either move, use your items, etc., and then finish your turn by making whatever attack it is you want to make. Now, this is why, in combination with things like Monster Initiative, that before combat, you want to buff up where you can. There are spells called like Wards and Cloaks that will buff your party until the next time you enter town, which means they last sort of indefinitely until you go back to town. These are spells that are going to do things like reduce, say, magic or physical damage, buff your attacks, that kind of thing. Now, the thing to note here, though, is that most of these are exclusive with each other. You can have 1 ward and 1 cloak active at a time, but for instance, the wards of magic and wards of steel are exclusive with each other, so you have to pick one. Now, outside of those sort of indefinite buffs, there are other buffs like haste and things that you can cast before combat, but the turn counter goes out really quickly outside of combat, which means that if you're going to buff up prior to combat, You really want to do it like right before combat starts to actually make use of those buffs, but it is possible and probably recommended on something like Torment, I would say. Now, on your individual character's turns, the main things you're going to be using are, of course, your melee weapons or whatever it is you happen to be using, but also mage spells, priest spells, as well as your battle disciplines, which is sort of your combat abilities for your non-magic users. Now, the Adrenaline Rush ability, which is a battle discipline, is why you want 15 points in a combat skill, even if you are not actively using that sort of attack type with a character. For instance, my mage wound up with 15 in blades, specifically so I would have access to Adrenaline Rush. This effectively allows you to attack 3 times per turn, which is a really great way to spam AoEs on a mage and sort of beat enemies down before they have a chance to get to you. If you need to crowd control, you can also do that, and it's a really handy way to deal with difficult situations. And if you do that across all of your characters, that's pretty much how you're going to outmaneuver your way around overwhelming numbers. Now, I will say personally, I don't love that approach. I think the sort of just enemy spam gets outrageous towards the end of this game. And while some of the actual like combat encounters where there's like specific things those characters will try to do or narratively they're important, a lot of those encounters I think could have been cut with little impact on the rest of this game, at least as far as I'm concerned. But that's basically everything there is to know about combat. You know, slow turn-based affair, what you see on screen is pretty much what you get. It's not exactly a complicated system. Familiarize yourself with the abilities and AoEs that each individual character is going to be using. Make sure you're not using elements that the enemies you are hitting is going to be immune to. For instance, don't hit undead with cold damage. It won't do any damage. A fair few demons are immune to fire, that kind of thing. But otherwise, it's not a terribly complicated combat system, but it is decently fun and engaging for the runtime of this title. But that does bring me to the Steam Deck section. So the Steam Deck can and will play Avernum. Now, obviously, the Steam Deck more than has the power to get through this absolutely hardware-chewing endeavor, but in all seriousness, you'll be perfectly fine. The main issues you're going to have is that Avernum is not a game that was made with controller support, which means you're likely going to have to adjust keys and everything. The game is only really going to show you mouse and keyboard buttons, and you'll have to simply find or make a layout you're comfortable with, and even then there's not much you can do about the fact that a lot of the text is going to be microscopic. But if you don't mind those things, yes, you can play Avernum on the Steam Deck. Which brings me to my positives and negatives. So the positives of this particular game for me were really the exploration. I really genuinely enjoyed just kind of wandering around the world map, exploring, finding new places, seeing how the quests there kind of related back to everything else I've been doing. It was really the highlight of the experience for me. It's really got that sort of open-end, old-school D&D module vibe, and I really, really enjoyed that. As a result of that, the story and the world are really fantastic stuff, and I can see why, just from those elements alone, that this game was as beloved as it is. That said, we've got a handful of negatives. Now, plenty of the negatives are self-apparent when you're looking at this game throughout this review, I imagine, but to give some specifics, I would say, as I've already mentioned, the excessive enemy encounters. It gets over the top quick, and, you know, it's fine once you get used to it, but there are definitely times where it's like, you're really pushing it. I can see why people just walk away from this, probably. When I've already killed the big bad and now I'm getting attacked by like 3 or 4 different mobs of enemies as I make for the door, it gets old, if nothing else. Another issue you'll likely have is with pathing. The game is not terribly great at letting you move a particularly long distance. It just literally won't let you move past a certain point, but sometimes even then you're still going to get stuck on stuff, especially in a boat for some reason. This game cannot path in a boat to save its life, which is really just the tip of the iceberg for its very clunky UI. So a lot of the UI is less than intuitive in the sense that while you can move it around and adjust it, by the way, those crosses on both your roster as well as the map will allow you to move those things if you need to. The issue is that you have things like your junk bag, the fact you have to open up your inventory to pick up items on the ground. Each character has their own individual inventory and has to be clicked on to do individual things, like say cast the spells you need, like Dispel Barrier on your mage, and while you can just click the button on the bottom, it then switches to that character anyway to actually do it, which can be annoying if you needed to click on another character for something else. And as a result of that, there's a lot of, I would say, just general jank, which you could probably tell, again, just by looking at this one. But that stuff is definitely where the problem of this game lies, and if you're willing to get past that, it's a great time. Which brings me to my conclusion. I am really glad that I played Avernum Escape from the Pit. As I mentioned, mentioned, it was a bit of a cult classic, and I can see why so many people enjoyed it. I think the world and the exploration are really special. I think the writing is good stuff. Again, just becoming more and more of a fan of Jeff Vogel's stories, the more of these games that I play. And while there are certainly some annoyances with playing a game like this, I think all of that is sort of easily justified by the game's price tag. You can pick this game up for $10 US, and even cheaper than that because it's old and you can find it on sale pretty regularly. And considering I got a total of over 70 hours out of this one, I think that's more than a fair price, frankly. And with that, I'm going to wrap up this particular video. So, hope you enjoyed all of that. By all means, let me know what you think about Avernum Escape from the Pit down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.